We are a connected society. We are connected to our families and friends, but also to our jobs and duties. We are connected over computer networks, phone lines, and traffic junctions. The world surrounding us is in constant movement and growth. We left our houses made of wood to plant an artificial forest from concrete, glass, and metal. It is not easy escaping a world where everything is connected to spend some time in the forest where we seek quiet and rest from our unsteady lives. We expect to find some kind of wisdom in the forest, but we don't understand the voice of nature. If those trees could only talk. Little do we know that in between this world of stillness, words are rushing back and forth. We only have to tilt our heads down and listen to our roots. The coastal Pacific rainforest of North America. These forests are special and known all over the world. Here in British Columbia, one can find trees of heights around 100 meters and over 1,000 years of age. People walk amongst these ancient giants in a sense of spiritual wonder and respect. But not anymore are these places only described by mythological metaphors. Scientists begin to understand the importance of these forests as they discover more details about the relationships between trees on a microscopic scale. Here in Canada, at the University of British Columbia in Vancouver, Dr. Suzanne Simard, professor of forest ecology, conducts groundbreaking research. Together with a team of passionate forest scientists, she tries to find out more about the methods of communication amongst trees.
Before I became a professor, I was actually a forester. And before that, I grew up in the inland rainforests of British Columbia. And so as a forester, I really was moving into an area that I loved, dear to my heart. I knew forests. And as I started working for the forest industry, I started to realize that what was happening didn't really mesh very well with what I understood forests to work like. So my job was actually to go into old clear cuts or new clear cuts and prescribe trees to be planted. And what the forest industry was doing then was basically planting 1 or 2 species in clear cuts. This was very different than what I understood forests to grow like, where there's mixes of species.
When we go walking in the woods, we expect to find nature untouched and pure. But in fact, we wander through an environment that has been largely shaped by men. Pristine forests are rather unique in the world. In a small country like Germany, forests have been intensively managed by people for centuries, almost everywhere you go. In an old, close to natural beech forest in the Eifel, a low mountain range in the west of Germany, forest ranger Peter Wohlleben is well aware of the value of the trees in his district. For more than 2 decades, he made his observations. In his best-selling book, The Hidden Life of Trees, he describes the most curious and unexpected things that are going on in his forest. He knows that this place is a rare treasure that needs to be protected.
Originally, all of Germany would have looked like this old beech forest. 80% of the area was covered with natural beech forests mixed with other tree species. But today there's only a fraction left, and we have plantation forests everywhere. These consist mostly of plantations with even-aged conifers that have been planted and are managed with heavy machinery.
What happened was that they ended up using the same species everywhere. And so sort of the standard practice was to clear cut and then plant either pine or fir or spruce, 1 species. And I thought, you know, what's going on here? The community is not intact anymore. It was much different than what I grew up knowing about these forests.
I studied forestry and started my career the classical way. I prescribed small clear cuts, cut down such beautiful old beech trees like these, and used insecticides. As a teenager, I wanted to become a conservationist, but I started to realize that I was in fact destroying everything, and that wasn't what I wanted.
And when I looked at those trees, I found that they didn't perform that well. They didn't grow very well. They were sickly. They weren't that healthy. And so as I became a scientist, later after a few years as a forester, I started to examine why these trees didn't seem to grow well when they were by themselves. And I found that when we removed certain species of their neighbors, that trees actually became ill. They became diseased and they were more at risk of insect attack. And I wanted to understand why that was the case. I thought that some of the story might be going on below ground.
What we call a tree is only what is visible above ground. We consider a tree to consist only of trunk and crown. However, the major part of its life takes place underground.
What happens in the forest is actually more than what meets the eye. The root system of a tree can spread as far as 2 to 4 times the diameter of its crown. Only scientists with state-of-the-art research techniques are able to dig deep enough into this matter to uncover that these roots are more than only water pipes.
I started looking at the root systems, and I found that the roots of these different species, when they grew together, birch and fir and cedar and hemlock, they were all intertwined and linked together. And I learned later on through more research as I went into my PhD that these root systems actually formed what's called a mycorrhizal fungal association. And mycorrhizal fungi are certain species of fungi which associate with all of the tree species worldwide, and they form a mutualistic relationship where the fungus grows in the root and provides the root with nutrients and water that the fungus gathers up from the soil.
Mushrooms are only the fruiting bodies of fungi, just like apples are the fruit of apple trees. Fungi are very underestimated organisms, because so far most of us appreciate only the fruit. Fungi can spread over several square kilometers. 1 teaspoon of soil may contain several kilometers of string-like hyphae that form the Internet of the forest. For their services, they charge sugar and other products of tree photosynthesis. The tree shares up to 1/3 of its total production with the fungi.
We found when we mapped these forests that all of the trees were all linked together in a single massive network. So then I thought, okay, if they're linked below ground, then what are these linkages about? How does this actually affect how trees are growing? We did some more sophisticated experiments once we knew these links were there, and labeled one tree with an isotope and then traced it from that tree to its neighbor. And we found that actually these carbon molecules were moving from one tree to another tree through these mycorrhizal networks. And so then we went on and we thought, okay, if carbon is involved, maybe there's other molecules that are involved as well. And so we started labeling trees with nitrogen and phosphorus and deuterated water. And we found that all of these elements actually move back and forth between the trees. That was sort of the rudimentary understanding of the language of trees. So these birch trees here would be linked, of course, to other birch trees, but also to the Douglas fir over there, and there's a hemlock behind it. And you can see the root systems coming down there. They go straight into the ground, and the mycorrhizal network is just below the surface of the forest floor. So as you're walking, you're only millimeters really walking on top of this network.
The network below ground can easily be imagined as a marketplace, where the food is either offered or received by all the trees that are linked together. But what about competition? If all are eating at the same table, then why don't they steal from each other and suck each other dry in a struggle for the survival of the fittest?
Trees of one species are not competitors. On the contrary, they actually support each other almost unconditionally. The weak are supported by the strong. Only together they can, for example, regulate the microclimate and lower the air temperature, because trees love it cool and moist. You could almost call this tree communism, and it functions perfectly compared to human communism. Here, the individual is not as important as the community.
Trees do care for each other. I mean, we think of that as an interaction between trees, but it's really, they're looking after each other.
Simhayats Dawaye, Nawapsh Bihanax Dawatogu, Gitlan Simshan Dawawatku. My name is Simhayats. I'm Teresa Ryan. I'm Simshan. I'm from the Gitlan tribe of the Simshan. My house is Shpihanax, and I'm Ganhada clan, Raven. My interest in research is the relationships of the forests to salmon. I'm a fisheries scientist, a fisheries aquatic ecologist, and I'm also a cedar weaver, a traditional Simshan cedar weaver. We have an understanding of these ecosystems around us and the relationships of things within them. And in many of our languages, we have certain words to describe that. In Somaliak, we say Sait Guldam God, which is one heart. The New Channels people on Vancouver Island, they say Hish Ish Tsawalk, which means everything is one. So it demonstrates those relationships that we've known and understood for a long time.
When we mistake trees for loners, each of them growing by themselves, oblivious to their neighbors and to the environment, we underestimate them by far. If forests are actually not the kind of harsh environment we expect them to be, where competition determines the survival of the strongest, fastest, and toughest, then maybe a closer look might reveal even further relationships that go beyond our expectations.
The forest industry wants trees to grow quickly. Initially, trees do grow quite fast when they grow by themselves. However, that is not what they prefer. Normally, trees would rather cuddle and stand closely together. They love company and like to take things slow. We need to relearn that trees do not need to be separated from alleged competitors. On the contrary, we need to allow them to live in tight groups, just as they like it. There is, in fact, friendship among trees. It doesn't happen very often because tree seedlings cannot choose whom they will be growing next to for the rest of their lives. Maybe 1 out of 50 trees will become friends with its neighbor, like these two. They grow their branches away from each other so that they don't interfere. Their roots intertwine intensively. It's like an old couple. If one of them dies, the one left behind might suffer and die soon after. For a tree, it is a disaster when the social network collapses. You can observe this right here in this forest. 3 trees have blown over. The remaining tree is now left by itself and gets sick. The tips of its branches die back. The leaves turn earlier in the fall, so it can't photosynthesize properly. It really suffers. In case it is not able to reconnect with other trees, it would likely die as well.
Do trees have a sense of friendship? You know, it's language that we're using here to describe how trees relate to each other. In ecology, we call those things interactions. Interactions, it's a very clinical kind of term. When we think of interactions, we think of, do they help each other? Do they compete with each other? Is one a parasite or a pathogen? So species interact in a whole myriad of ways. And some of them are beneficial. We call that in science facilitation. In human relations, we call that friendship.
A grove of maple trees with cedar in it will indicate to us that the cedar is got enough moisture. It's got the right moisture regime. When cedar and maple are growing together, there's a relationship with those 2 trees.
So it's just a matter of language. When I think back to my early work with plantations, and we were planting single species of trees and weeding out the species that we didn't want, and I found that Douglas fir would suffer when we took birch away from it. Well, we were affecting that facilitation that was going on between them, the transfer of carbon back and forth, the nutrition that the birch provided for the fir, the resistance against the pathogens that were in the soil. When we took the birch away, well, Douglas fir lost its friend. They lost its facilitator. So is there friendship in forests? Well, I can use that language. Sure, there's friendship in forests. There's mutualistic facilitative relationships going on all the time.
Tree connections may form bonds of friendship, but they also link each tree to all the others over hubs, very similar to a computer network. Scientists who try to visualize these connections have been creating complex models that look like a map. A map of the Wood Wide Web.
We were also able to identify by looking at this map which trees were the most important part of the network, which ones were the most highly linked. And we found that the biggest, oldest trees were actually the most highly linked. We ended up in the end calling these mother trees because we discovered through this map that the younger ones were growing up by hooking into the network and growing up around these mother trees.
Trees are very social beings. The parents, the mother trees, are looking after their offspring. Their roots grow together and they feed them with a sugar solution. One could say that the mother trees suckle their offspring.
To some, it may seem strange comparing the flow of nutrients between older trees and their kin with human relationships. So analogies like that, based on the observations of a practitioner, should rather stand on a solid ground of scientific facts. At UBC, students from the Faculty of Forestry conduct basic research about the relationships between mother trees and their kin.
All of our experiments involve both field and greenhouse experiments. We use basically similar techniques in both, one to verify what's going on in the other one.
So what we actually do is go into the field, into a Douglas fir forest, and we gather soil. And that soil has a mixture of mycorrhizal fungi that prefer to associate with Douglas fir. And we use that particular mixture to inoculate our trees.
We would grow mother trees, basically they were seedlings in pots, and inside mesh bags, where these mesh bags would either allow the mycorrhizal network to form with the neighboring seedling or not.
So we're using mesh bags to keep the roots from going through and touching each other and transferring between roots. We want just the fungi to be able to meet in the middle.
And then over a period of a few months, allow these two seedlings, the mother tree and her kin, or the mother tree and the stranger, to communicate with each other. And through this mycorrhizal network that had formed. We had to be able to do the experiment in a greenhouse, so we couldn't bring in a big old mother tree and plant her in a plot. We had to use seedlings because of the restrictive environment of a greenhouse.
The idea was that this seedling that had been grown up first and was well established would have sort of more nutrients to spare than the one that had just started to be established. So if that one that was previously established had sort of more resources that it needed, that it could sort of shuttle some of those resources to its little brother, say, that was growing up next to it.
The term mother tree is a really nice term because we understand the importance of mothers in families. And so it's a term that resonates with people, but it's probably it's not the most scientifically accurate term. Really what we're talking about is relatedness. So whether mother trees are related to trees around her or new trees that are coming up in her neighborhood. And so it's really about, whether their genetics are well related to each other or not, whether they're distant or close together.
One of the differential responses was when the new seedling that was planted, the younger sibling, if you will, was planted, and that seedling was related to the older seedling, the big seedling actually slowed down its growth rate. So it appeared that it would sort of make room for its younger sibling to grow.
So we would label these mother trees with C13, which is an isotope that we injected into a plastic bag around the seedling.
And that bag completely seals in the air, and we allow the seedling then to photosynthesize. So as we apply the treatment, the seedling is only able to photosynthesize with 13 CO2, and any sugars, any products that it makes are going to be labeled. So we then look for that 13C in the recipient plants. And remember, the recipients are either kin or stranger. And so we'll look at the ratio of the amount of carbon that's present.
We bring the pots into the potting room, we clip them, and then we clean all of the roots. So we brush off all the dirt, we wash them, and then they're ready to be morphotyped. So we do that using a microscope. We look for all the fungal connections on the root tips. After that, they're ready to be dried, and we do that in a large drying oven. After that, each one of those portions separately is frozen using liquid nitrogen, and you're able to grind them using a mortar and pestle. And that sort of creates a bit of a powder. That powder is then weighed in really small increments, and we send those to the lab for some microspectroscopy to evaluate how much carbon-13 is in the sample.
And we found out that seedlings that were kin seedlings were receiving more carbon from mother trees than strangers were. And so then it starts to look like a family, right? So the mother tree is nurturing her own family, but she's also kind of looking out for her whole neighborhood. And so it's not just a family, it's a whole community of trees that each with their own role to play in the forest.
Mothers who care lovingly for their neighborhood and their children. Also, Peter Wolleben has a way of expressing the behaviors of trees in a very humanized language. When guiding groups of visitors through his forest, this helps to make biological mechanisms understandable for everyone. When he talks about tree families, he goes further by claiming that they even provide a good education.
This is a typical beech kindergarten. Beech trees grow up in groups, just like this one. The parents raise their children very strictly by limiting the available light. Only 3% of the sunlight reaches the ground, so that the small trees need to stretch towards the little remaining light. The benefit of this is that they grow straight trunks which can resist strong winds. However, like in every class or kindergarten, there are little rascals that do as they please. They grow this way, they grow that way. They think, oh, I don't have to stretch towards the light. Slowly, their classmates surpass them and switch off the last bit of light so that they die off. Eventually, from this entire bunch, only 1 or 2 trees will remain to grow old.
Then we discovered that the mother tree was affecting how those seedlings grew. So if we changed the linkages or we removed them, those seedlings would behave differently. They would either grow worse or they would grow better. What we were gathering from this, that if the mother tree was trying to make a favorable place for her seedlings, then she would encourage their growth. So send more nutrients to those seedlings, and they would grow better. If the mother tree knew that the environment around her was not very hospitable for her young, in other words, if there were diseases or insects around, then she would make it more difficult for those seedlings to grow. She would be antagonistic towards them or become more competitive. And this said to me that the mother tree was communicating with her young in order to favor the survival of those seedlings, whether they should be further away or close to her, depending on how favorable the environment was. We are doing these experiments out in the forest as well. So we're going to actually go to big old mother trees and grow seedlings that are related or distantly related to her and see how they perform. So we're going to be verifying what we're seeing in the greenhouse with what's going on in the forest.
Trees are studied and measured, cultivated and cut. They seem defenseless because they can't run away from any threat. Some plants, however, have developed amazing skills to react to attacks. The response of this mimosa makes it obvious that even plants don't like to be hurt.
Trees have feelings. They can feel pain, but can also have emotions such as fear. This is apparent, for example, in this oak behind us. It grows these clusters of twigs, signs of great distress. But the oak would behave differently if, for example, attacked by insects that bore into its bark. It would feel pain, electrical signals would run through its fiber, and the oak would accumulate defense substances. At the same time, it would alarm its colleagues via root network and fungi, so that they could already accumulate defense substances, although they haven't been attacked yet. Once the insects arrive, the other oaks would be prepared. A forest is much healthier and more resistant when individual trees warn the rest of the community as soon as they realize something is wrong.
At the same time that we were looking at carbon transfer or this energy transfer, we were also looking at defense signal transfers through these mycorrhizal networks.
It's mysterious that a plant would, leak these particular compounds and that a fungus would pick them up and then essentially transmit them, through their hyphae to another plant. you know, we haven't seen this before, this flow of signaling molecules.
And these defense signals, we're trying to figure out what the signals are. We have an idea that there's certain compounds involved, but what happens is that the injured seedling sends defense signals. The seedling that receives the signal, or that piece of communication, that piece of those words, if you can think of it that way, then we know they upregulate their defense genes. Those genes then start to produce more defense enzymes, and those enzymes then increase the defense of those seedlings against the attack by those insects.
I guess when you're scared, your body is producing, your body's making chemicals that are telling your whole body that you're scared. So it's getting your legs ready to run, it's getting your arms ready to do whatever they need to do. And those chemicals, they're specific for that purpose. If those were to leak out of your feet and something in the ground, let's say a fungus, were to pick up those chemicals and then transmit them through the ground, so move them through the ground, and someone else standing nearby were to pick up those chemicals through their feet and get scared, right? Because they'd get those scary chemicals in their body. That's like what we're looking at with the trees, is that this guy gets scared, it's sending those chemicals among its own body, and then they go out into the roots. And the question is whether the fungi, which are an entirely different organism, right? Not a tree, in the ground are moving those chemicals through the ground, and if those are being picked up by the other trees.
So specifically, I'm looking at defense signals, which I induce using western spruce budworm onto Douglas fir. And the tree that has the western spruce budworm elicits a response from the tree, which then is sent into the mycorrhizal network and gets transferred to an adjacent seedling that is attached via a mycorrhizal network.
2 plants in a pot. They're Douglas fir seedlings, which is what we tend to use. They form strong mycorrhizal networks. And they're planted inside mesh bags. Those mesh bags can either be very, very small in their pore size and block mycorrhizal networks, or a bit larger and allow mycorrhizal networks. So we compare treatments where there are networks to treatments where there are not, and see if that transfer occurs.
So this is where we place the spruce budworms and entice them to eat these little budding areas.
So you clip off the branches and then you dip them in liquid nitrogen. And you scrape off the needles and then put the stem in another vial. And you dip it in liquid nitrogen because you want to freeze what's happening. You measure gene expression by looking at RNA, which is a really short-lived chemical. It can degrade very quickly. So you want to take it off the live plant and dip it in the liquid nitrogen as fast as you can.
So the defense signals, or the warning signals, are happening really, really quickly, so that you know, when there's an injury, then it's an instant communication, almost instant. There's an immediate upregulation of genes that increases the defense. It is actually a knowledge that's being passed on from the seedling that's injured to the new one. And so that knowledge is based in wisdom. And so I think of it more as passing on wisdom.
It's important for a forest to sustain all of its members, including old and dying trees. Even stumps that you would expect to have died hundreds of years ago are being kept alive. Possibly they have stored memories that they can pass on. This is an ancient stump, and it is still alive. The inner part of the tree, the heartwood, is without life, much like dead bone. That's why this one is rotten inside. In trees, life is located in the sapwood, in the cambium, and in the roots. And all of this is still alive in this one here. The question is, how can this be possible? It doesn't have any more leaves to photosynthesize and nourish itself. Still, it must consume sugar, otherwise it would die. The only possible explanation is that this tree over there keeps the stump alive via root connections that are running across here. It appears very social and touching that this old stump is still being nurtured, the forest's own nursery home for the elderly.
We find that when trees are cut or they fall over or they break over with the wind, that the stump continues to live. And we can tell it's living because the cambium in the bark just grow over the top of the stump. There's no way it will grow into a new tree because there's no seed or there's no apical meristem there. But the stump is still alive because its root systems are actually grafted to its neighbors, or they're linked in through their mycorrhizal networks, or both. And when you have that pathway, then what's happening is that the trees that are alive around it are actually sending carbon from the foliage down into the root systems of the stump and keeping that stump alive.
Where does a tree store its information? How valuable is such a stump to the community? So far, we don't know where a tree's memory is located and where it stores experiences. For example, droughts that occurred a long time ago can influence a tree's behavior over many years. This demonstrates that they store this information somewhere. It is quite likely that this storage sits partially or even entirely in the roots. An ancient stump like this might pass on its knowledge to the neighboring trees and its descendants. It's now known that processes occur in the root tips, which are quite similar to those of the brain. Obviously, it is presumptuous to claim that trees have a brain just like animals. However, they make decisions within seconds that are partially processed electrically. All of this takes place in the roots. So maybe we could call this a tree brain.
Through these various experiments and our discoveries, I've started to think about the root systems of trees and forests as the brains of the forest. There's a number of reasons for this. First, it's the pattern of these connections, the pattern of the network. When we look at how it's arranged, it's very much like how a brain is organized. So there's certain central hubs in forests where things are highly connected, and then sort of satellite nodes where things are less connected. If you look at a neural network, it's patterned very much in the same way. So there's that. And then secondly, the idea that there are chemicals that are transmitting from a mycorrhizal root tip or a root of one tree through the mycorrhizal network to another tree. This is like in our brains, we have neurotransmitters. That's not that much different than carbon and methyl jasmonate and nitrogen and water moving back and forth through these mycorrhizal networks. There's another part to this story as well, and we know that in dying pine forests, for example, that are attacked by mountain pine beetle, that those dying trees affect the mycorrhizal communities. And we know those seedlings in healthy forests have got a better suite of defense enzymes than those from dying forests. And so we know that it's not just a carbon legacy that's being passed on, it's also messages about the defense chemistry of the new seedlings coming up. And so I think we need to really think more carefully about how we manage these dying forests. And that we're going to be dealing with this more and more and more as trees are changing. Like tree species are going to change as climate changes. There's going to be a mortality, and our response has been to go cut the trees down as quickly as possible, make them into 2x4s and sell them. And you can easily see that by doing that, we're cutting off the opportunity for the old trees, the dying trees, to pass their legacy onto the new generations.
When we cut down trees, not only do we disturb the microclimate of the forest, but also the relationships between the trees. They become loners, and we won't be able to observe these wonderful processes anymore.
Managed forests are a convenient way to transform the natural disorder into efficient, fast-growing plantations of rogue trees. It's getting quiet. Planted forests don't talk much.
Plantations are like a group of only children without parental guidance. These trees are planted with clipped and damaged roots, which results in disrupted communication, along with many other dysfunctions. The trees are forced to fend for themselves, which leaves them more vulnerable. If a tree suffers, it won't receive help from its neighbors. If one thrives and could share, it would rather grow a little faster, which is also not healthy. In a forest, speed is always negative. In Germany, there are no more pristine forests left. In the past centuries, numerous activities took place everywhere in the forests. Here, for example, charcoal production took place. This forest will likely be very close to natural again in about 100 to 200 years. Only very few places like this still exist in Germany. But currently, the forest industry is becoming increasingly radical, and more wood is being harvested. Sadly, we are turning back the clock. These plantations are increasingly managed with heavy machinery, and these machines compress the soil. They destroy the pore volume, and life in the soil suffocates. This includes also the fungi, which are extremely important for the communication between trees. Most machines have wide tires, so damage caused is often not so visible on the surface. However, compaction remains and increases with the size of the tires. The soil becomes compacted down to 2 meters. This is comparable to a sponge that has been squeezed, but unlike a sponge, soil doesn't recover. Pore size is lost along with oxygen content. Compared to before, in some cases, only as little as 5% of the water can be stored. This is extremely dangerous for trees because here, during summer, trees depend on winter precipitation. And if this can't be stored anymore, the trees may die of thirst during summer. And according to geologists, soil damage below 20 centimeters remains beyond repair until the next ice age.
Diese Schäden, die bleiben erhalten nach Aussage von Geologen bis zur nächsten Eiszeit. Im Pferderücken werden die geernteten Stämme.
In horse logging, harvested stems are first cut to a maximum of 5 meters, a length that a horse can handle. The horse navigates gently around both big and small trees and barely causes any damage.
Dicke Stämme herumrangieren, das verursacht dadurch praktisch keine Schäden.
Even today, horse logging could be done on a large scale. However, most horse loggers don't find enough work because there isn't sufficient demand. One could argue that if all harvesting would be done only with horses, it would exceed the number of horses available. That may be true, but when the demand grew, more people would be motivated to practice horse logging. It is a wonderful job that has already been practiced for thousands of years. I am certain that today it could be just as successful. Obviously, we would need more personnel to replace large machinery. One harvester replaces 12 workers. So, if we would turn back time, we could create 12 new jobs. Interestingly enough, this pays off. We earn more because we preserve the soil and the forest is more productive. It grows more wood and better qualities, while we generate more jobs. More money, more jobs. I like that.
Finde ich gut.
We didn't treat forests like families at all. We treated them like rows of corn plants, basically. And so this new understanding that we suddenly had that mother trees were linked to all these seedlings and other trees below ground and favoring her kin completely turned the idea of how we manage forests upside down. Now, instead of rows of trees, it's families of trees. And how you treat a family of trees is going to be very, very different than how you would treat individual rows of trees.
As a forester, you like to think that you are helping the forest. But in fact, it's comparable to a small child that fiddles with a clockwork, thinking that it can make it run smoother afterwards. That means we need to keep out of such an ecosystem if we want it to function. We can take something every once in a while, but once we start to destroy things, we will eventually reach a point of no return. We as humans make great demands. We want to be warm during the winter, so we heat our homes with wood. We want furniture, we want to use paper. That's okay, but obviously this clashes with the idea of an intact forest. We should be aware that when we use a chainsaw, we can't be doing any good. We pretty much slaughter a tree. As long as there is a certain limit to it, the forest will be able to cope. But if we take too much, it will be destroyed. What every single one of us can do to take better care of the forest is simply to reduce consumption. With over 7 billion people, we can't keep going on at this level.
Is this the survival of the fittest after all? We use trees to provide wood for our homes, which we then build where once these trees used to be. Our cities grow and displace the forests. Have we unwillingly turned to enemies who compete for the same ground? Is there an alternative to how we treat forests so that we are able to coexist and preserve what is still left?
In the world of forestry, I would say that foresters generally don't pay any attention to it. Either they don't know about it, or they're so wrapped up in the traditional ways of practicing forestry. They've become so rigid, in a sense, in how they do things, that the idea that things can be connected below ground, and therefore that, to conserve those connections would mean doing forestry in a very different way.
Und dabei sollte man übrigens auch die Sprache
We
ändern.
need to change terminology. We shouldn't claim that we are tending to the forest when we are, in fact, utilizing wood. Just as a butcher is not an animal keeper, a forester is no forest keeper. Once we realize that we always destroy something when we use a chainsaw, we might start to treat the forest more carefully.
And to me, I think there's an enormous opportunity to transform how we practice forestry so that our forests are more wise, have their language intact, have their families intact. They're going to be around in the future, whereas the planted forests that we're putting back, where we don't conserve those features or those qualities of a community, those ones are going to be way more at risk. Just like, if we become isolated in our societies, we're more at risk. It's not any different than forests.
Die Gemeinde Hümmel, bei der ich Förster
The
bin,
municipality of Hümmel, where I'm a forest ranger, has placed all of the remaining old beech forests under protection. That's very rare in Germany.
über 200 Jahre.
At over 200, these beech trees are comparatively old. Here, they can live their social lives entirely undisturbed.
Vielleicht nur noch 1-2 Promille der
Only in forests like this can one observe the intact social life of trees. It is possible to manage forests so gently that they can emulate pristine forest processes. But that means removing only single trees here and there and leaving the rest of this social community alone. Planting, tending, producing great wood qualities, trees can manage this all by themselves. We can pretty much sit back.
When the public or people hear about connections below ground and that there's mothering going on in forests, people immediately say, oh yeah, of course. I see this all the time. I knew this all the time. I'm so glad that you've done this science that validates what I've always felt about a forest. And so to me, that's hugely powerful. There's already a sense out there. And, we as humans are part of that forest, and what we're perceiving is really valuable. And we should be paying attention to that because it's true. It's true in our hearts. It's true in the forest. And so to me, that's a super important message that this is a natural fit. It's a natural fit in forests, and it's a natural fit with how we interact with forests, and it's something we can learn from forests to bring to our own sense of community and family as well.
Hopefully scientists like Suzanne Simard and observers like Peter Wohlleben are able to change the way we look at trees. Looking at nature has often helped engineers to find inspiration for groundbreaking inventions. Looking at the forest might inspire us to live in a healthy human community that appreciates the natural processes surrounding us. Next time we take a walk in the forest and ask ourselves if trees can talk, the answer lies below the surface. Trees do talk. What they want to tell us remains yet to be uncovered. Maybe all they say is, let us be.
Can you imagine being a tree living by yourself without neighbors, without others around to care for you? Trees don't do well when they're by themselves. They blow over, or they get too much sun or too much water, or they're more at risk of getting a disease. But when they're in a community and they've got neighbors around that protect them, really they are caring for each other. They're making sure that they're a productive, healthy, vibrant, diverse community of trees, families of trees.